Hello friends, welcome to the 10th part of the series on the British revenue extortion in Tirunelveli district. So without further ado, let's get into this. And in this part, we will look at something known as the Olungu system. So in the previous part, we saw that, first you had the Amani system, then you had the decennial lease system or the 10-year method of fixing revenue from 1810 till 1821. So from 1821 till roughly 1860, uh, they ran a system known as the Olungu system. So I don't know what the Tamil pronunciation of the Tamil original word is. This seems to be an English corruption of it. So if somebody knows the original word, please put it in the comments. So the Olungu system was quite long running, and Dharampal has described, this system as kind of the best of the worst. So Tirunelveli district was lucky in a sense, and that they had the Olungu system, whereas the Rayatwari or the Ryotwari was implemented everywhere else. So how did this fiction? So how did this not fiction? How did this system function? So I have done a nice flow chart. I used one of the online tools. But what I don't want you to go away with is an impression that this system was absolutely fantastic. I've just created a neat flowchart to explain how it worked, but the system didn't really work in such a neat and well coordinated fashion. So it was actually quite a messy system. So the first thing was the British government fixed a standard market price. So what was the standard market price? So it was the price of grains in the wholesale market. Now, this standard market price typically, as a lot of things, was fixed unrealistically high. And the second step was now based on the standard market pr- price, the SMP, the government fixed what was known as the Melavaram. So, Melavaram is the government share of the farmer's revenue. Okay, and this was fixed for a village, and this was based on the standard market price. And now comes the interesting part. So there was this kind of calculation. So what will happen if the market price goes up 11% compared to the standard market price? So if the standard market price is, for example, 100 rupees, say, per quintal, and the market price rises by 11%, so it becomes 111 rupees. So what happens to the government revenue share? So if the market price rose by 11% compared to the standard market price, the commutation rate, so commutation rate was basically the revenue demand, so the amount of revenue payable, it increased by 1%. What happened if it didn't increase by 11%? Let's assume that the market price fell by 6% compared to the standard market price. So instead of 100 rupees per quintal, the market price went down to 94 rupees. Okay, so in that case, if it fell by 6%, the commutation rate or the revenue demand was reduced by 1%. Okay, and if it didn't fall by 6%, so if it was still somewhere between, so it was greater than 6% but less than 11%, then the commutation rate or the revenue demand was as per the standard market price. So like I said, this flowchart is very neat and clean. I created it this way to explain the process. In reality, the process was quite messy. So again, which is why I've titled this slide maybe not so great. So first thing, as I pointed out, the standard price was set unrealistically high. Okay, and there were a couple of other issues. Now remember, Tirunelveli district, like most districts in India, there are parts which have got very good water access, so canals, wells, lakes, ponds, etc., and some parts which have got intermediate, so maybe dry brackish wells, and some parts which are completely barren. But so if a village had poor water access, then the Olungu system became a millstone around the neck, because like I said, the standard price for the land produce was set unrealistically high. So the market price was anyway unrealistically high. If it had good water access, then there was another problem. So every acre of land was assumed to be fertile. Now again, as I pointed out repeatedly, if you have 10 acres, you won't farm the complete 10 acres. You might farm say 5 acres, leave 2 acres for grazing for animals, 2 acres free for something else, and so on. So you might actually be farming only on 50 to 60% of your total land, but you ended up paying tax on every acre of the land. And I have and there were 146 different Olungu rates. So there was no standardization, there was no scientific survey. So the British simply didn't have means or didn't want to spend the money to do these things. So 146 different Olungu rates, and it was very arbitrary. So some villages, they had a very favorable arrangement depending on who they were dealing with, whereas some villages, they ended up paying through their nose. And another problem was as the market price went up. So there was a steep rise from 1843, which went up to pretty much 1859 before there was a market crash. So the tax that the farmers had to, or the villages had to pay, went up exponentially. So by 1858, that tax demand had jumped by more than 40%, and in 1858 the tax demand was around 28 lakh rupees. So 28 lakh rupees of that time. So it's a very, very high amount. So let's have a look at some of the graphs and charts. So this is kind of continuation. So net income of farmer in rupees per acre. Again, average yield is 547 kilos throughout the British occupation till the 1930s. And income in rupees, you can see for most part, it's completely negative. It's still in the negative. And it's a massive period. So in the previous two parts, the time periods were actually quite short. So we had 1801 till 1810, 1811, and then 1811, 12 roughly to 1820, 21. But here, this is almost like 40, 45 years period. And you can imagine you are at least one and a half or two generations going through this with being overloaded with debt and having absolutely no earnings. And this earning kind of goes into the positive because there was like I said, there was a spike in the market prices, and especially in the build up to the American Civil War. So there was a spike in prices, but this was again temporary, as we'll see in the next part, where we deal with the next system, the system of Pakal Durai, which was brought in. So net amount of grain left, again unsurprisingly, it's all in the negative because the farmers were in debt. They had absolutely no grain reserves left. And this spike you can see is actually shows a glut because there was around this point 1859 there was a market crash, so the farmers were actually left with a lot of grain, but he had to pay a lot of tax. So it kind of was a catch 22 situation. But you can see consistently that the amount of grain in the negative is hovering around 15% for close to 40-45 years. So that's a very long period. And this is the last slide. So Rayatwari land revenue as percentage of average yield per acre. Okay, so on an average for this 40-45 year period, this fluctuated roughly around, so the average roughly comes to around 40 to 41%. And again, as I point out, you have to add the costs of cultivation into this, and the farmers kind of reserve stock, and basically he's left with nothing. So the Rayatwari land revenue with all of these additional costs goes to roughly anywhere between 80 to 110%. And that's reflected in the earnings per acre and the amount of grain left, which is consistently in the negative for this very long period. So you can imagine what would have happened by the end of this period. Okay, so short video. In the next part, we will have a look at Pakal Durai, and I'll explain who Pakal Durai was. So friends, if you have liked this video, please remember to share, like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next part. Hari Om.